Good afternoon, class. Professor Wasser here. This week we're going to be working with Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, that name might sound familiar to some of you. To some others, this is going to sound a little bit weird, German sounding. But Nietzsche is probably one of the more, let's say, popular philosophers on the list of readings that we're going to be doing this semester for legitimate and illegitimate reasons, right? I think Nietzsche is possibly one of the more misunderstood philosophers. He's commonly misconstrued as a young man's philosopher. I see why that could be the case. I see why some people may make that assumption. But what I think is more important, I think, is the way any one of us might take his philosophy to heart. So before we do that, I'd like to kind of just jump in and share our Canvas and show you where you should be for week 3. So here we go to our course. I'm filming this at the time when it's not open yet, but right here, you'll be reading pages 26 to 32 of Twilight of the Idols, okay, which is morality as the enemy of nature. And the reason I have you guys reading that particular reading is because, if, for all intents and purposes, it's going to sum up what Nietzsche's really getting at when it comes to what he's about, okay? For Nietzsche, the only way to live life in a post-God world, and we'll talk about why he's talking about the world as a post-God world or a post-theological world, is to be an individual, okay? And what it actually means to be an individual. And for him, morality, moralizing, and theology in the world as it is today is really just an excuse to not do that, right? And for all intents and purposes, it's bad. He calls it bad conscience, right? Kind of a way to kind of make excuses for ourselves and get out of our own, let's say, the responsibility we have for our own desires and our own wills. So with that being said, let's go ahead and open up the slideshow. I'm going to have to update these because I think these are a little bit out of on your end, and I apologize for continuing to burp. Apparently, the icy that I had coming into work is having a little bit of an effect on me. So, yeah, folks, I like to open up with memes from time to time, and I think this one really kind of sums Nietzsche up in the best possible nutshell, which is that you only live once, but the life that you live, you have to live infinitely in an eternal recurrence. In other words, this is the closest thing that Nietzsche is going to have to an ethic. We're going to cover this in a couple of slides, but it's effectively this, which is, if you're not living a life that you want to live infinitely and eternally, then why are you living that life at all? Okay, you need to figure something else out. Okay. Now, Nietzsche is a 19th century German philosopher, more like a Prussian philosopher, I would say, notable for his contributions both to the existential canon as well as psychology and philology, right? That's really important to understand that Nietzsche is, by all accounts, and he even considers himself this, kind of like a proto-psychologist. And you'll see this as we kind of break down the layers of the psyche that he talks about later on in this lecture, or the next lecture, because we're going to break it down into 2 parts like I did previously, okay? He received his degrees from the University of Bonn and Leipzig, okay? And he would notably go on to be the chair of philology at Basel. Now, many of you have probably not heard that term philology before. You may never hear it again outside of this class because some people never bring it up. But philology is effectively the genealogy of language. And that is something that Nietzsche is adept at. He's adept at taking a look at words, examining the root of the word, not the root in the sense that we typically think of the root in terms of linguistics, but literally the wellspring of the word, where it came from originally and what it originally meant, and understanding how that's changed across time. So we'll look at words like good and evil in a text like, on the genealogy of morals, right? And we'll start to realize that good and evil were not the original indicators of value in society, that those were largely the product of an increasingly self-conscious, almost to the point of neuroticism, a self-conscious version of humanity, right? And it's that self-conscious version of humanity that each one of us still is. The question is, how do we move forward with that? Yeah, so that's something that you need to understand. He would have to leave that position, actually. Nietzsche is actually kind of the poster child for the sick boy, as I like to call them. For as much as he likes to talk about strength and self-overcoming, Selbstüberwindung, right? Nietzsche was sick throughout the better part of his life, okay? I hope you all don't mind me removing my hat. It's warm right now in the office. The air conditioning on campus does not necessarily always work. And, I'm going to have to kind of navigate that on my own. But one thing I don't need to be doing is, trapping in all the excess heat with the nylon hat, right? Yeah, but the thing is, if you read Nietzsche, like if you read Ecce Homo, which is his autobiography, you're going to read that it is precisely that sickness that allows him to understand the value of life. And I think we all recognize that if we think about it a little bit deeper, that it's in the times when we really have lost something or stand to lose something that we learn to understand what is valuable. And that's going to be something that Nietzsche talks about quite frequently. In order to kind of deal with that, he spent the majority of his life in the Alps, where he'd write the better part of his works. But folks, his as he called it, dyspepsia, right? Bad stomach, that would follow him through the better part of his life. And in fact, he would die from some serious medical complications later in life. Okay. Now, what you need to know about Nietzsche is notable for using a variety of genres to kind of put his philosophy across. Much of this is going to be polemical. If you don't know what the word polemical means, basically, and I'm going to use a phrase here, and pardon the crassness, Nietzsche is a troll to a certain extent, or a shit poster. If you guys are familiar with Reddit or any one of those, message board groups, right? Someone who, a shit poster, basically goes out there to stir the pot, right? And Nietzsche was fond of that. Nietzsche was fond of going out and not necessarily covering up what he thought in order to kind of, like, let's say, put across some academic ease or some intellectual rumination. No, he said exactly what he thought. He didn't pull punches. And ironically, I think that's one of the things that perhaps mischaracterizes him the most. But I think it's also one of the things that is most characteristic of him, in the sense that people take what he says to heart, and in doing so, they miss his point, right? In many instances. So, I mean, if you read on the Genealogy of Morals, for instance, he's going to talk about things like master and slave morality. Don't get that twisted. He's not talking about slaves in the sense that we talk about slaves, right? In the same way, he's going to talk about priestly castes and the aristocratic class. He's going to call the aristocratic class the beautiful blonde brutes. That's not him actually championing the aristocratic way of being, although he did hold a certain respect for, like, let's say, pre-modern humans in the way they approach problems. He's just simply saying that, to a certain extent, they were stupid and beautiful, whereas, the modern human is kind of smart but self-conscious and kind of conniving, and I think we all can recognize that if we think about it. Okay, so for instance, Birth of Tragedy. Birth of Tragedy is something we're going to be talking about later on this week with the different layers of the consciousness. We're going to talk about the Socratic, the Apollonian, and Dionysian levels of the psyche. That's traditional prose, traditional philosophical essays. And Nietzsche actually hated The Birth of Tragedy. He thought that it was one of his worst works. This is, by the way, accompanied with a critique of Richard Wagner, the great German composer who late in his life turned to Christianity as opposed to leaning into his more hedonistic, or let's go with hedonistic, historical tendencies, right? Why? Well, ostensibly because he was about to die. And because when you're about to die, well, maybe people tend to find God pretty quickly when they're about to die. Okay? You have Human All Too Human, which is a series of aphorisms. Folks, aphorisms, aphorisms, whether you realize it or not. You see them all the time, right? If I were to say, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, right? Or every man is only a play actor of his own ideal. Or, well, let's leave it at those two. Those are the entirety of the entries, right? Those are complete entries. I'm going to be showing you another aphorism from the gay science here in a little bit. An aphorism is just a short platitude or a short burst of intellectual. I would say it's an intellectual gold nugget, right? That most people are not intellectually savvy enough to get away with writing, right? Nietzsche himself said it best in one instance, where I can write more in a sentence than other people could write in a book. No, strike that. More than any person could hope to write in a book. Now, that's going to sound arrogant to many of you, but as you read Nietzsche, I think you'll realize he's right. That's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. Okay. You've got the gay science, again, more aphorisms. You've got his lone literary work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is where we get his concept of the three metamorphoses and the Übermensch, which some of you may hear that phrase, Übermensch. I want to be clear. When you hear the phrase Übermensch, don't mistake that as Superman, right? You go on Etsy right now and you looking for like Übermensch gear, you'll find pictures of Nietzsche with a Superman symbol on his sign. That's actually wrong. Uber does mean super in German, but the fact of the matter is that Nietzsche meant that differently, right? If we look at Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's going to talk about humanity as we are, modern humanity, and he's going to speculate that there's going to be a more profound version of humanity that manifests in the future. He's going to call that Übermensch. And really what we are, he says, man is a bridge between ape and Übermensch. And what he's talking about is overman, beyond man, right? A version of humanity that is not constrained by the self-consciousness and the doubt that we constrain ourselves with at every given turn. Let's face it, every single one of us is guilty of that, myself included, myself especially. So we need to think about that, folks. Like, what would that be? If you pay attention to pop culture, you'll see people like the Columbine killers who thought they were Übermensch. But the fact of the matter is that if they were Übermensch, and they had no fear of being caught, there was no concern about what would happen after the fact. They were doing what they thought was right because it was right, and not because there was anything to be lost by being caught, right? So, Übermensch is a very difficult concept for people to grapple with because it's not us, right? We are, as Nietzsche will call us, the last man. We're a very, like I said, psychologically fragile version of humanity. Beyond Good and Evil, which is a combination of short essays and aphorisms, and Twilight of the Idols. On the Genealogy of Morals is a series of traditional essays, and then he's got his autobiography, Ecce Homo. So right here, Nietzsche's showing a broad range of capacities for writing that most of us, it's difficult for us to learn to write in one way. He's writing in all ways. And in so many of these ways, he's pulling apart the fibers of what the modern intellectual, not even intellectual, but the modern human psyche is. Okay? And he's going to be a precursor to people like Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud. Freud is writing right about the latter end of Nietzsche's life, so if you think about that, that's very important to recognize. I mean, right here, we see that Ecce Homo's published in 1900, Freud's writing in 1901. Yeah, folks, this is Nietzsche kind of being the precursor to all these modern psychological theories that we still hold today. Things about the unconscious drives, right? So you need to understand that. Now, what's notable about Nietzsche is that for all things going, and this seems to be a very common tendency. Nietzsche had a bad go of it, right? He typically, for all intents and purposes, had terrible relationships with his mother and his sister, Elizabeth. He idolized his father, but his father died young. Elizabeth, what's interesting about Nietzsche is he's typically, very frequently, kind of associated with the Nazi Party. The Will to Power, which is a bastardized version of his final text that he never finished, was basically, the gaps were filled in by Elizabeth, and it's kind of sold off to Hitler and the Nazi Party. So when you're reading Will to Power, and it's one of the earlier versions, really reading is, Friedrich Nietzsche, / Elizabeth Nietzsche, the Nazi, So please keep that in the back of his mind. It's easy to fall into the trap of associating Nietzsche with the Nazis for the simple fact that, one, again, and we read this with the existentialism primer last week, Nietzsche did not believe in the idea of equality. Perhaps not equality under the law, which I think maybe he would have been in favor of, although he never wrote specifically about it, so maybe I'm just speculating there. But I think he would, but it goes without saying that he did not believe in equality in the truest sense of the word. He felt that everybody had their own, pardon the phrase in Nietzsche, that they filled. Everybody had their own strengths. And that to think that we're equal is to deny those individual aspects of ourselves. And some people were just, I'm sorry to say, weak. Some people were not capable of transcending the conditions of their existence, okay? Like many people of his time, like many artists, because Nietzsche did actually kind of look at himself in the same way as an artist, as well as a psychologist. His books didn't sell. He didn't become popular until later in a lot of ways. And as a result, and not as a result, but as a result of so many compounding factors, he'd have a mental breakdown in 1889, right, when he was 44 years old. And the last recorded, and I think this really gets to the heart of Nietzsche, which is this guy who is very invested in kind of a return to the natural state of humanity, or as close to a return as possible. The last thing he was noted as saying was, I understand you, to a horse he'd seen being whipped to death in the center of town square. So there's this horse dying there, and he collapses over top of it. I understand you, the whipped horse, okay? There's a metaphor there, and I'm not quite sure I know what it is, but basically he'd be catatonic for the next 11 years, at which point he would die. Now, here's the major thread, the heart of Nietzsche's work. Selbstüberwindung, right? Self-overcoming. What Nietzsche needs you to understand is that you are something to be overcome. Today, you are who you are. But the fact of the matter is that every day you have an opportunity for improving yourself. And that's the point of Nietzschean philosophy, becoming a better version of yourself. The acorn doesn't just turn into the oak overnight, right? But within the acorn is the oak, okay? Your whole purpose, Nietzsche's going to say, and this is the theme of will to power, right? Power is not a thing to obtain. Power is a state of being. And for Nietzsche, the whole purpose of life is to express that state of being, to express that power, whatever it is. Okay, now we're going to have different phrases for that over the course of the next couple of slides, but you need to know that that's what Nietzsche really wants you to get. He wants you to become whatever it is that you are. Now, Nietzsche is an anti-systematic philosopher. This is a theme between him and Kierkegaard. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to start looking at philosophers who are more systematic. We're going to start looking at Plato and Aristotle. By the way, Nietzsche does not have any lost love for Plato, so please don't get that twisted. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have a series of thoughts that might fit into a system. For instance, he's frequently said to not have an ethics. Okay, he critiques ethics on the genealogy of morals. In fact, he says that most moralizing is just a substitute for cowardice. I'm too cowardly to do what I want to do, so I'm going to moralize about it and kind of wag my finger at you. And that doesn't sound a whole lot like social media, does it? But that's not true. He does actually have an ethics, and it's the most simple. It's actually a meta-ethics, okay? So for instance, for anybody who's curious, you have normative ethics. Normative ethics tell you what you ought to do. So if you ever take Philosophy 151 with me, you'll know that Aristotle is a virtue ethics person. He says that the good life, eudaimonia, is achieved through the pursuit of virtue. So that's what you ought to do to be an ethical agent, pursue virtue. Kant is going to say, follow duty. Now, duty is a very, difficult term for Kant because, like duty isn't what's written out in a book. Duty is what you feel here. Right, so in a lot of, but it's not just what your senses want; it's what basically, for all intents and purposes, I'm going to use this word, though Kant doesn't. Conscience wants you to do, and then like someone like Mill would say, no, what's ethical is what satisfies utility, what creates the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. That's normative ethics. Meta-ethics doesn't try to tell you what to do; it tries to tell you how to figure out what you ought to do. So Nietzsche's version of ethics, and it's called the eternal return or the eternal recurrence, is perhaps the most profound short ethics I've ever read in my life. So real quick, I'd like to go to this. This is actually 2 slides ahead. Okay, and this is the entire piece, folks. This is from the Gay Science. It's Gay Science Aphorism 341. Okay, and it's called the eternal recurrence. What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliness and say to you, this life as you live it and have lived it, you'll have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sign, everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? Well, folks, What's Nietzsche asking of us there? The key to Nietzsche is two things. First, you need to learn not to, how would I put this? Overthink the obvious. He's asking you exactly what he wants to ask you. Okay? Hypothesize this. He's not saying that you will live life innumerable times over. Some people try to pose this as kind of a transcendental theory about reality, and it's not. Okay? Nietzsche's asking you a very simple question that you have to consider in the here and now, because for Nietzsche, everything is about the here and the now. Okay? If you're not living the life you want to live, if you were to be cursed by a demon today that would make you live the life that you've lived already, and you'd have to relive it in exactly the same order and succession, would you curse at the demon or would you thank them? If you thank them, you're living a life you want to live. Good. If you're not, then why aren't you living the life you want to live? Go live it. And that's Nietzsche in a nutshell, folks. So, okay, what we're going to do, okay, is we are going to cover this last slide, and we're going to leave the Dionysian task, and we're going to leave the birth of tragedy for the second lecture, okay? But I do want to cover a couple of basic principles. And the keys here, folks, is that Nietzsche is very keen. He talks about this in On the Genealogy of Morals, that very frequently the truths of human existence lie in what he calls the gray, not the blue hypothesizing of British empiricism, right? This kind of highfalutin and, let's say, optimistic way of looking at reality. He's going to say that a lot of what we deal with as humans is in the dirt, it's in the griminess, it's in the muddiness of reality, and a lot of that is, as he calls it, gray. He thinks that's a great metaphorical color for what it is, and that's why a lot of what we look at as being bad or inherently bad is not bad. So, for instance, envy. Typically, when we speak of envy, in our day-to-day lives, it's looked at, you shouldn't envy others. You should be grateful for what you have. Well, no, Nietzsche says. Envy is important because, one, it tells you what you respect and what you love, okay? If you have an enemy and you envy them for what their kingdom is, for who they are, right? That's not a bad thing. You should envy them. They're better than you, and you should strive to be them, okay? In any attempt to moralize otherwise, it's just an attempt to get your way out of pursuing what you really want. Well, you know, that's just me envying my opponent. I shouldn't want that. I should be happy with what I have. Well, that just makes you a weakling. Okay? And that's what's key to Nietzsche. Okay? You should have the strength to admit what you want, and you should have you should be willing to take the steps you have to get what you want. Okay? But there should be a sense of honor in it, right? You shouldn't have to sneak around and use moralizing or intellectual, let's say, subterfuge to get the things that you want, right? He's going to be a proponent of temperance and self-discipline, right? If you want to become greater, you have to be able to work for it. And what's more important about this is that this is all coming as a result of one very important realization. And I'm going to throw it out here because you've all read this somewhere. Well, maybe not. Your generation is very, very young, so maybe you're not used to this kind of thing. Folks, Professor Wasser's an old man. We used to, so for instance, when I was deployed, when people were bored, they'd write on the, porta-john walls or the bathroom stall walls, wherever you're deployed. Okay, and inevitably you ran into someone who wrote "God is dead," and it was always written in like huge letters and with punk with an A with the anarchy sign, and like as if it was some kind of celebration. Here's what you need to realize for Nietzsche: the reason he's valuing all these, let's say, young man principles, go out and get what you want, earn it, make it happen, is because for him, God was dead. God remains dead, and there'll never be enough water to wash away all the blood. Now, what that means, in the same way that for Kierkegaard, God does not mean what we think it means. God is not Sky Daddy with whiskers. Okay? For Nietzsche, God prior to the modern epoch was universal values. God was what kept society together. But the fact of the matter is that science, the pursuit of truth, right, which really God wanted us to pursue truth, right? Well, the pursuit of truth killed God. Okay? It killed universal values, and it brought us to a state of individuality. Now, that is not a cause for celebration for Nietzsche. Not necessarily. Nietzsche wasn't necessarily happy about that, but what he did think about himself, this is where he came into play, is that, well, in the absence of a unifying God, he could be the new God, in the sense that he could present a telos, a purpose, a driving force, human, towards Ubermensch, towards the overman, right? And that was his role, was to present this kind of material that would kind of, let's say, save us, or let's say redeem us from a nihilistic existence, okay? So yeah, folks, we needed to find something to kind of fill that God-shaped hole. For Nietzsche, there was really only one option, and it wasn't politics and government, right? And it wasn't science, because here's the thing, in the absence of God, God equaling truth, right? If there's no truth, there's no science. If there's no science, then there's no philosophy. Philosophy died in Nietzsche's eyes. The only thing that was really redemptive, that could bring us back from the brink, Nietzsche thought, was art, the humanities. And that's why someone like me specifically, we champion the humanities. You know, you might not look at reading something like Shakespeare as very important. You know, reading Shakespeare isn't going to build you a shed. But it's going to do something else. It's going to make you a better human. Why? Well, because we all identify with those stories. There's something real. There's something true in them. And that's how we develop. So, okay, that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Oh, what do you know? I'm willing to bet I've got apparently my loan has been approved, the one I never applied for. Okay, folks, I'm going to leave this lecture here for today. We're going to pick up with the birth of tragedy. We're going to talk about the Dionysian task, which is really the will to power in a different phrase or another. Okay, so folks, have a good day. I'll talk to you in a bit. Bye.